But our guest today found inspiration for her first novel, Cradle in the Oak, Miss Candace Cox Wheeler from Biloxi, from an old newspaper clipping. In fact, so old it was back in 1906. And she is joining us today to share a little more about her book. Hey, Candace.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you today?
Well, I'm sad that you're not here because you were supposed to be in studio with us today on Good Things because of the Mississippi Book Festival. But the show must still go on. But I know you're bummed that you're also not gearing up and headed out for the book festival, too.
Yes, I am. I know that everybody who was going to the book festival, both the authors, the booksellers, and the readers, are disappointed. But I think based on the numbers and what our hospital personnel are experiencing right now, it was the only thing we could do.
Oh, agreed. And I think it's always a good time to maybe find us a new novel or a good book to read, settle in over the weekend, and just sort of disconnect from the world that feels like it's falling apart. And going back to a very different time, which is 1906, which whereas your book kind of kicks off or got its inspiration. So I read, Candace, that it was inspired by a newspaper clipping. And I think this is really interesting. So share with us the story around that.
Yes. Well, it all started when my husband's grandmother passed away, and she had this old trunk, and she always told everyone, you can't open that trunk until after I'm gone. So, of course, after her death, we were anxious to see what was in the trunk. And one of her great-granddaughters was going through the trunk, and she found this old newspaper clipping, and it was a clipping about my husband's grandmother, and it was a story about how back in 1906 she had traveled by train across the country trying to locate her children. And the reason she had to try to find them was her husband had left with them and his young mistress, and she had no idea where to find them. So that was all the information we really had, except for this. There was this real intriguing little paragraph in there that caught my attention, and it said, handicapped by traveling alone across the country as a woman, she had cut her hair, donned masculine garments, and changed her name to Harry. Now, I found that really interesting.
Yeah.
I couldn't find anything else about it, so I had to kind of create something. That's where the historical fiction part comes in.
Well, Candace, I mean, it's one thing to sort of find a story about that, you being your, husband's wife. So this would be your grandmother-in-law, I guess you would say. How did your husband and the family sort of react to that, to know that Granny had this secret in the trunk in the attic?
Well, I think they were surprised. My husband comes from her second marriage, which would be the husband that she had after this particular husband. And the families back then would have a lot of years between children. So the children that were involved in this actual incident were older and had moved out of the house by the time my husband's father and his brother came along, and she just never talked about it, and she kept it hidden in this trunk. So it was, one of those deep, dark family secrets that just never got out there until after she passed away. And then, to me, it was an inspiration because she had done so much to try to find these children, and at a time when women just couldn't get out and travel across the country. So it just, I said, there's got to be something there that I can take and do some research on and find something to write about. And that was my inspiration. I had never written anything before, but this inspired me.
Well, it definitely inspired you. And then it set you on a quest to get to know Biloxi back at the turn of the 19th century, which I know you yourself, Candace, are a fourth generation native there of Biloxi, Mississippi. So what are some cool things that really stood out to you when you started to research your own hometown over 100 years ago?
Well, Biloxi has such a fascinating history, and 1906 just turned out to be a year that all kinds of things were going on down here on the coast. We had the Biloxi Yacht Club was holding its regatta, where we had schooners built by Biloxi's master boat builders, all meeting up at the yacht club and going on a 15-mile course out into the Gulf and coming back. And we had it was the seafood capital of the world back then. and population was about 8,000 with all different types of nationalities. We had people from Switzerland, France, Italy, Spain, Nova Scotia, Germany, Croatia, Lebanon, Scotland, Poland, England, and Ireland. If you just can imagine all of those people coming down to the coast to start their lives and their families, and all of that was just getting started really good in 1906. We had your basic food that we have today, the jambalaya, the gumbo, the pucheradas. The tourists would be coming to this area by coal-powered steam engines on boats and trains from New Orleans and areas all over the country to enjoy the hospitality and take advantage of our nice warm weather and beautiful coast down here. And so that part of it wasn't that different from what we experience today down here.
One of the things that caught my eye, Candace, I was over on your website looking at the tab Inspiration, and it was the 1906 June McCall's sailor hat and whatever. Is that like the same McCalls that we all have memories of our moms making outfits out of? Did that translate to the same, McCalls patterns?
It was, and what's interesting about that back then in 1906 is they would have magazines that would come out, and they would be like big paper, like almost look like a newspaper of today, and it was called the McCall Bazaar of Fashions, and they would open up these things as they'd come out each week, and they would see what the newest fashions were, and then they'd go to their stores and they'd get pick out their pattern number, kind of like we did when we were young with our parents, pick out pattern numbers and come home and they'd make their clothes or have someone make it for them if they didn't know how to sew.
Well, I love that piece to it because it definitely connected to just, I guess, our own sort of memories with our grandparents or our moms, but then also to connecting us back to our own state. I mean, there's so many of us who have our own experiences with the Mississippi Gulf Coast. A lot of us listening to Good Things, maybe you're from there. So I feel like, being able to go back into a different time, but still visit places that we can see when we go to still visit. I mean, you have the lighthouse in there, you have the pier or the bridge in there. What other major sort of touristy attractions come up in Cradle in the Oak?
Well, we have the old People's Bank, which is now Elsie's Hardware, and that's on the corner of Howard and Lemieux in Biloxi. If you get down that way, right across from City Hall, kind of close to that area. And the Bank of Biloxi was where Bank Corps South is now. The downstairs part was the bank, and the upstairs part was the Duquette Theater back then. We have the Magnolia Hotel still around. The Redding House is still around. Mary Mahoney's was around back then, the old French house. You can still get on Biloxi schooners, the replicas today, with the Maritime and Seafood Industry Museum. And that particular museum is just filled with things that inspired me to write this story. And it was so funny, the more research I did and the more interesting things I found out about the coast during that time period, I started writing. I just kept writing and writing and writing, and I had way more information than I needed. So my editor, publisher, Joe Lee, was the one that kind of set me back on the right track and kind of convinced me, okay, let's get this plot moving along here, Candy. You're kind of getting bogged down. So that was how that all came about.
But it sounds like you thoroughly enjoyed the process of getting to know at least the environment and the atmosphere around in which your characters, live out this story, which is found in Cradle in the Oak. And I think that comes through. I think when you're enjoying the process and writing something like that, that's a big part of it. You should want to be researching it till the cows come home, so to speak, before you start to really be able to share that story. And I know your grandmother, your husband's grandmother, who really, I think, inspired maybe the main plot, she's not the only family member that sort of has its character representation in there. So which other family members of yours maybe find their way, at least fictionally speaking, or inspired a character in the book?
Right. I have different, like there's a section in there about a French Cajun family.
You know what, Candace? I'm going to give you a pause on that. We're going to keep you over the break, and we're going to learn more about Cradle in the Oak, inspired by 1906 Biloxi, Mississippi. Author Candace Cox Wheeler, coming up.org. And if you're headed to the Mississippi Gulf Coast anytime soon, or maybe you're from there and that's how you're tuning into Good Things, then I hope maybe you spot some of the places in Candace's new novel, Cradle in the Oak. Okay, Candace, so you did all of your research for 1906 Biloxi, which has completely got me interested. By the way, I think it should already be a movie, and I haven't even read the book. Just from hearing from what you have researched and about your husband's grandmother. But let's get to, and I'd asked you about the other characters. We'll get there. But let's talk about Cradle in the Oak. What's the inspiration behind the title?
We have a lot of beautiful oak trees on the coast and throughout the state of Mississippi, but mainly along our coastline. And I wanted something that would depict our coast and at the same time be something that would go along with the novel. So I have a scene in the first chapter where the main character, Carrie, is looking out her window at the oak tree in her front yard, and there is a branch that almost touches the ground, kind of like a cradle, and it was the spot where her two young sons used to sit and read their book or just play on that oak cradle. And when they disappeared, of course, every time she passed that tree and that empty cradle, she thought about her sons. And so that particular image stayed with me, and that's where the title came from. And then again, it comes up throughout the book and at the end of the book.
So throughout the book, you've used inspiration from your own life. Obviously, it's your husband's grandmother. Say her whole name, because I had it down, and good Lord, back in the day, we think that we have double names in the South. Hers took it to another level. So how would you say her name?
Okay, her name was Carrie Artemis Beausarge Barnes Wheeler, and her maiden name was the Beausarge, and then her first husband was the Barnes, and then my husband comes from the Wheeler.
Okay. I'm glad. I was thinking, man, if we had to monogram that in today's society, you wouldn't be able to get it all on a T-shirt or a towel. But that's just different times for sure. So who else in your family, Candace, maybe found their way into the book just as inspiration for a character or two?
Well, I wanted to combine my family and my husband's family, and since this is fiction and I'm allowed to do those kind of things, even though that was not in 1906, that didn't happen until we got married in 1980. But what I did was the main character, Carrie, I have her family being Abears, which came from my side of the family, and they had the Cajun French influence that was so popular on the coast during that time period and still is here today. And I also used my great-grandmother on the other side, which was the Cox side, and she plays a little cameo role in the story. And one of the things I did, Rebecca, was with friends and historians that I talked to on the coast during that time period to get my information that I needed to write this novel, I asked them about their ancestors. And if their ancestors were here during that time period, I tried to include them in little parts of the book, and that made it more exciting for me, too.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so you were a first-time novelist, Candace, and so you got inspired by the newspaper clipping, that was found of your husband's grandmother. And you just said, I'm going to write a novel? I mean, have you been writing, maybe journaling or short storying your whole life and just never thought to commit to a novel? Or was this just completely green thumbs, going all in, let's do a novel out the gate?
Yeah, I guess I've thought about it off and on throughout the years. I majored in journalism at Southern, and then I went on to law school, and I became an attorney. So I've spent most of my years, the past 40 years, practicing law with my husband, and I just, between that and raising two sons, hadn't found any time to sit down and actually write anything that could be a novel. But I often thought, I'd like to try to do that someday. And then when this came along, I probably looked at this article for 4 or 5 years before I decided, you know what, I'm going to try to do some research on that time period. And, of course, once I started doing that research, I was hooked.
How long did it take you to complete the novel once you committed to at least putting your thoughts on paper?
It probably took me about 3 years.
I love that, though, and I think it's encouraging to those who listen to good things and think it's too late for me, or maybe they still have a story going around in their head that they would love to put into words or put characters to it, and they just think the boat's past them or whatever it may be. And it's never too late to try something new or to get out a creative outlet or to create a new creative outlet, should I say, even if you've never really done it before. Would you say that too, Candace?
Yeah, I would. And what I've done is I'm still practicing law. So in the mornings, I spend my time writing, and in the afternoons, I go to the office and work there. And now I'm hooked. I'm already halfway into my sequels. So, I think once you get that writing bug or whatever it is that gets into your system and says, I want to do this, and then you convince yourself that maybe you can do it, that you find something within yourself that just opens up those creative juices and gets you going.
So if we're listening to good things and we've been looking for a new book to read, we need something that takes us away from, everything going on today. How would you describe this novel to someone who maybe just was looking for an escape? Is it a mystery? Is it a thriller? I'm sure there's a love story. How do you best describe it, Candace?
It's kind of a combination of all of those things. She, of course, is faced with, a trauma. This is any mother's worst nightmare, and she wants to go find her children. Her husband leaves her with no money, so she has to figure out how she's going to support herself so she can take this trip, and so she has to reinvent herself. And during that time, she comes across a lot of things that, try to interfere with this process that she's trying to do. And, you've got everything in here from New Orleans mafia to people who are around her who want to help her, people that she's not sure if she can trust or not. And it's suspense. I think most of my readers have told me that once they pick the novel up, they're just kind of read and read till they get to the end, because there is suspense through the entire novel till you get to the end, and there's a little bit of a surprise at the end. So I think it's a combination of all the things you mentioned.
Even though it's fictional and it's not necessarily completely based off of your in-law story, because she's not around anymore to sort of fill in the blanks, were they, I guess they are. It would be a terrible question to ask you. Are they pleased? No, they're not pleased. But, were they excited to see that the story at least lived on, even if it's in the novel fictional realm?
Yes. In fact, they're some of my biggest supporters. They've really enjoyed the fact that this story is out there and that it is something. I think everyone in the family is proud of what this woman tried to accomplish by going out and trying to track down her children. And even though we don't know all the details, there was enough information in the article to let us know that she did have to travel to the east coast of Florida. And so that's why I picked up and kind of did some more research into St. Augustine and Palm Beach and that area in 1906, and tried to visualize if she went to those areas of Florida, what it would be like.
Well, you've left us wanting more, which is exactly what you should do, Candace, particularly when you're talking about a novel, and that's Cradle in the Oak. So you're not here where we can come by and meet you centrally and give you a hug and get an autographed copy with the book festival being canceled. But how can we get a book?
Okay. It's available at Lemuria Bookstore in Jackson, Impression Books in Flowood, and Lorelei Books in Vicksburg, close to your area. And I will be at Lemuria on December 20th, along with a couple of my fellow authors with Dogwood Press, Randy Pierce, who recently wrote Missy, and John Floyd, who recently wrote Lighten Up a Little. And all three of us will be there on December the 20th at Lemuria.
What about in the rest of the state? Are they in your local bookstores from Oxford or Tupelo, Starkville, down on the Gulf Coast?
They're in Starkville, and they're down here on the Gulf Coast. We have them at the Seafood Museum. We have them at Hillier House in Ocean Springs. We have them at Bestport Seafood, the Biloxi Visitor Center, Lynn Meadows Discovery Center in Gulfport. And I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but I do have them all listed on my website, which is cwheelerauthor.com.
All righty, Candace. Well, if you're ever in the central area, please stop by the Good Things Studio. We'll go back in time with you again, but I appreciate your time today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate you calling me and talking to me about all of this. It's very exciting for me to talk to you about it.
All right, you guys stick with us. We got more